Thank you very much, Philip. Originally, we were hoping to have the DEFRA Minister, Lord Benyon, with us today, but unfortunately, due to the sad passing last week, he's unable to join us. So it falls to me to update you on horse movement and transport challenges. And I remember fondly my interview when I started at the TBA just over 5 years ago. Julian said to me, "We're taking a very leading role in this area. Don't worry, after a couple of years, I'm sure it will." It will be resolved and we won't be having to take such a close eye on it. Over 5 years later, I'm still standing here delivering this presentation, but I shall go through that now with you all. So the trustees received a letter from member Paul Murphy asking for a report at the AGM on the TBA's efforts to resolve the current challenges in cross-border horse movements following the UK's exit from the EU. As I've said, the TBA has continued to play a role ever since the result of the referendum in the Thoroughbred Industry Brexit Steering Group and its ongoing activities. Julian Richmond-Watson continues to chair the steering group, and myself and a number of other members of the executive are a vital part of the industry's coordinated and ongoing efforts to deliver the solutions. We work with the wider equestrian sport industry, who are experiencing very similar challenges, and with our European counterparts to try to effect change. So as part of our ongoing activity, the steering group monitor quarterly the volume of thoroughbred movements between the UK, the EU and the rest of the world. And whilst it's been over 18 months since the transition period ended and some important mitigations have been achieved, these graphs illustrate the industry is still seeing significant disruption to thoroughbred movement levels. So in 2021, the number of thoroughbred movements to and from the UK was down 28% on 2019 levels, with Irish movements down a very similar percentage. What we are finding is movements for breeding have been more affected than those for racing, and the greatest impact has been on those movements to and from continental Europe, which those of you who have tried to move horses probably will not find a surprise, which in 2021 were half of what they were in 2019. This year there does appear to be some bouncing back in those continental movements, but they're still a long way below pre-Brexit levels. So we obviously received a lot of anecdotal evidence that the extra cost and administration was having an effect, and this has been backed by the data that we are recording, and it's affecting not just our export business, but those of our European neighbours. On the positive side, we believe these administrative and financial hurdles can be mitigated against. But the first point I just really want to reiterate, and you've heard me say this a number of times at these presentations, is that since we've left the EU, our ability to directly influence EU policy has obviously gone. And so we were reliant on our Irish and our French counterparts in particular to make representations with the EU to reduce the burdens to facilitate our export trade with them. I know the Irish in particular have been very active in this area, and I'm in regular contact with my counterpart in Ireland. However, to date, I think we all recognise there's been very little meaningful change in the processes, albeit the main transporters, who we keep in very regular contact with, do report very few operational issues now, that they are now aware of what is required, particularly moving to Ireland. Obviously, our overall objective remains to reduce the administrative burdens on the movement of thoroughbreds. However, again, the reality is the political climate between the UK and the EU means that in the short term, whilst there are very strong commercial and welfare arguments to facilitate change, there may not always be the political will to drive those forward. On the UK side, that's something that we can influence, and there's currently minimal requirements for those importing horses into the UK with no checks at the border. And where there are any sort of requirements, we have been working hard to try and mitigate against those as well. So the first is around VAT, and the need to lodge VAT for temporary movements had been a barrier, but this is something that we have been able to address. So the thoroughbred industry, alongside just the art market, have had a specific facilitation granted by HMRC that means approved transporters no longer need to lodge temporary VAT payments on movements of thoroughbreds for racing and breeding as of July this year. It took us a year to get there, but we've got there with that. We're also working to streamline and improve the UK health certification process, and provide evidence in fortnightly meetings with DEFRA policy officials, representations in all the consultations the government have been running, and we also hosted a delegation of DEFRA and APHA officials for 3 days in Newmarket in April to highlight the challenges to our industry. One direct output of this was building some better relationships and new relationships, and through that has come the automation of APHA export health certification approvals, which underwent a successful trial at the Tattersalls July sale and should help with us expediting exports out of standard business hours, because somebody literally had to be sitting there in Carlisle and press a button to approve those before we got this facilitation. So the UK government are aware of our issues, they're publicly acknowledging them, they're saying all the right things, and we are part of the industry working groups feeding into the government's plans for the future, and which at the moment is focused on a new target operating model for the border, which we're expecting to be rolled out later next year. So what are we doing for the next sort of year to 18 months? We have 3 main policy work streams that we're working on. The first of these is digitisation. So through this, we're looking to ensure full engagement and integration with the development of the new government's equine ID systems that they're building. We want to integrate our great digital technologies provided by Weatherby's and the e-passport with these government systems. We want to develop digital export health certificates, and DEFRA officials have asked us for details of what we can provide in that regard. And we're also speaking to international jurisdictions, particularly obviously Ireland and France, to make sure our digital systems will be reciprocated by them and accepted by them. Second point is import control checks. In the very short term, there are still some issues in certification requirements between the UK and the EU on imports, and we're working with DEFRA on trying to minimise and remove those inconsistencies to make that easier. And secondly, as I've already mentioned, this targeted operating model, we're working very closely with government on trying to make sure that the movement of horses is taken into consideration in that model. And that then comes on really to the high health, low risk status, which we're lobbying for as a new status for the thoroughbred and for horses that can reach a certain biosecurity standard. What's become increasingly clear to us through all these conversations, both with the UK and the EU, is that the current difference between registered and unregistered horses that we have to follow is insufficient. That, a registered thoroughbred is kept under very different health conditions to perhaps another registered horse, which all it needs to do is be registered in any stud book. The movement of thoroughbreds is genuinely low risk for the biosecurity of the broader equine herd, as was shown for the 50-60 years that the tripartite agreement was in place. And so we are developing, alongside government, a definition of how a low-risk horse, such as a thoroughbred for racing and breeding, might work in policy and in practical terms. So this could then be applied through the level of import control checks that thoroughbreds might see in the future. Hopefully will be lower than other standards of horses, and also in our discussions with our international partners as a basis for future sort of UK-EU trade relationship, and any successor to the tripartite agreement or a common veterinary area, which are a couple of the EU proposed solutions that are out there. This low risk status of thoroughbreds would be a key component of that, and that's where we're focusing our attention on.